Would you stand with me as we read God's word? And I read. The sons of Noah, who went forth from the ark, were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In brackets, Ham was the father of Canaan. Verse 19. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. I'm going to stop here, just take a quick break. In verse 18, where you see that bracket, what it normally means is that at some point, whoever was copying this manuscript added just a note. This is a note of an additional explanation, if you will. So that's kind of the purpose of that. Ham was the father of the Canaan, right? So, verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked back and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. Will you pray with me? Heavenly and graciously, Father, we come before you this morning, realizing our incapabilities in and of ourselves and our need for your grace and your sustenance. Lord, I pray that as your word is preached this morning, you would bring to my mind all that you would will me say for your saints this morning, that I would not speak mere opinions, but would indeed teach what your word is teaching us. I pray that you'll humble all of us to the authority of your scripture. I pray that you'll soften our hearts. You'll make us all learners. Humble us where our pride may grow strong, that we might behold the wondrous things out of your word. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. I ask this in your name. Amen. You may be seated. So, when I'm having a rough week or when I'm just in a little bit of a fog, I have this temptation, if you will. It's a habit that I love to do whenever I'm down. And it's not really the best, so don't judge me too much, but I'm going to share it anyway. I love to watch people get pranked by eating really spicy foods. It's random, I know. But there is something about watching someone not expect it, or maybe even expect it. They take a bite of that thing, and they're depending on their ethnicity now. Their face goes bright red. They start sweating, and they just lose it. And they're trying to scarf down gallons of milk. For some reason, that cracks me up. It just makes me laugh. And there's this new YouTube TV show where celebrities eat hot wings. Funniest thing ever. Okay, so anyway, I'm watching it, and there was a specific one that had a compilation of different videos of different people eating really spicy stuff. And it was one of those days where I was like, I just need to sit down and laugh. And Ariel had to be sitting next to me while I was watching these things. I am bawling. My laughing is hilarious. We live in an apartment. I hate what my neighbors were hearing. I was cackling like a jackal, just making noise. And so I'm lost in my own humor and laughter. And I can just look over and see my wife, and she's mortified as she is seeing people on this screen suffer under the acid heat from eating hot peppers. Now, to my defense, it's their fault for following through with a dare and eating a ghost pepper. I mean, I'm from Nigeria, and I won't do that, okay? And somehow they thought this was a wise idea. But I remember in that moment looking at Ariel's face, and I was like, I guess this isn't really just a funny thing to watch. People are actually going through immense pain. It's absolute torture when it's going in through their mouths. And it'll be even worse torture when they're sitting on the toilet seat. But for some reason, it is the funniest thing. And I hate to be a joy kill, because it was a joy kill moment when I started thinking about why I was laughing so hard, and my holy wife, of course, was over there, so convicted and felt so sorry as if people were suffering. And I summarized it as this, like I was finding pleasure at the expense of another person. Like the fact that they were in pain, and it wasn't necessarily the pain thing, it was just, anyway, okay, I'm trying to defend myself already. But that's just it. It's the hard truth. Like I was finding it funny that they were under torture from the heat of eating spicy food. It was just hilarious to me. And though it's light and though it's funny as an example, that's similar to kind of what was happening here. When we examine this first part of Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 to 29. I've divided it into two sections. It's really just following the text. Is from verses 18 all the way to verse 25, or 24 rather. We're going to look at the event, what happened here specifically. And then after that, we're going to look at the specific curse. That is verse 25 all the way to the end. So let's read that first section. Verse 18. The sons of Noah who went from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole ark were dispersed. Now we get to the story, the event. So Noah began to be a man of the soil. He planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. So let's stop here. You know, we just came last Sunday off of the high of the covenant and the explanation of the fact that the beauty of the covenant that God made with Noah is that it was ultimately dependent on God, and very little was dependent on Noah's own ability. So we leave that high, that fun, yeehaw, let's go, let's rally behind this. And then we enter into this wonderfully interesting scenario where Noah has now been off the ark and is enjoying the nice land that has been made wonderfully fertile, I can imagine, after there's been a lot of floods for about 40 days to cover the land. But it doesn't need any more water to make that thing healthy. So he sees how healthy it is, pops a few grapes in it, and it's a bountiful reproduction. There's just so much that comes from it. And he gets this good idea to start making some wine. It's very interesting how the Hebrew author, we believe, generally speaking at this church, is Moses, recognizes the fact that it was the abundance and the overindulgence of this drink that led to the sinful end result, or the calamity that is about to take place. And so this brother was drinking so much that all his sensibilities had left him, and he was left there lying naked for the whole village or whoever was there to see. First thing we obviously learned here is this: it's not good to engage in overindulgence of absolutely anything, specifically something that harms your sensibilities so much so that you begin to act in a disgracious way around those who are there with you. Another thing I want us to do is that when we see this phrase nakedness, there is this temptation, as has been throughout all these years, to kind of minimize what happened here. So we have to force it to be worse than it might actually be, if you would say. So from this phrase, as we'll move on, there have been different interpretations of what it meant for the nakedness to be uncovered. But I think to have a real, right, and appropriate understanding of what it means, we first have to realize that Noah was the person that uncovered himself because he was drunk. Noah did it, which is very different from the stories in Leviticus, and we'll get into all of that, I absolutely promise you. But Noah's drunk, and he's naked. And remember, nakedness is not a good thing, right? And it has a specific weight, especially in Genesis chapter, the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Remember Genesis chapter 3? The sin, the realization, if you will, of Adam and Eve, that they had fallen from the grace and obedience of God, and then their eyes were opened to see that they were indeed naked, and then by their own foolish needs, they tried to get fig trees and leaves to cover it. Though it's not the exact same thing, there's definitely a poetic working, if you will, kind of like a poem here, where Moses is bringing out that same nakedness. Even after the flood, the nakedness of man, or the mess of sin, still persists. Verse 20, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. Verse 21, he drank of the wine, became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan. So notice there's always this specification that the writer does. Ham, the father of Canaan. Why do you think that is? Well, for us to understand this part, we also have to remember who the original audience were. The original audience were most likely the Israelites that were in the wilderness headed towards the promised land. And who was in the promised land? The Canaanites, right? And so Moses essentially is sharing it to them, and he's like, hey, so remember Ham, the father of Canaan, it seems like he's about to explain why the people in that land are as bad as they are. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. And then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both of their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. So what's happened here? The father's disgraced himself. Yes, he's fallen short, if you will. But on top of that, Ham, his son, sees this as a wonderful opportunity in the midst of his father's shame, sin, and disgrace to find fun in it, to mock it, if you will. And you can kind of see the parallel on different levels. The example I gave at first, right? I was laughing at people having their tongue burned by eating pepper. Now, I could defend myself and say, well, they're the ones who went to go and do it. Like, they obeyed the dare, but I was still finding humor at the detriment, at the expense of somebody else. Just like Ham, too, in this particular moment, is finding humor, if you will, finding disgrace or something to disgrace his father with at the expense of his own father's respect. In different cultures, there are different things and values that we have that have very high importance. There can be a temptation for us as Western folks to read this story and be like, what's the big deal? Especially as we get to the curse. Well, be it because they aren't thinking of it as we did, but they are definitely understanding it as we saw in Genesis chapter 3. You are not to look upon the nakedness of another. The best equivalent today that I could think of was something that is from a culture that I'm from, that none of you guys are from, but I'll still use it. In Nigeria, we have this thing where you do not collect or give something to someone with your left hand. You don't do it. I'm not sure if they do that here. Everything is with your right hand. So you could be left-handed, but you best give your grandma her phone with your right hand. And it's not one of those things where it's just like, oh, that's a rude kid. You will get popped from nowhere. Like, you'll just slap your head from nowhere if you gave somebody something with your left hand. Now, when I got to the story, apparently, I don't know what it is with these examples I have today, but apparently the expectation is that with your left hand, that's kind of what you use to take care of yourself in the bathroom. And so the right hand is the hand you're not meant to use. And so when you encounter someone who's older than you, you get something from the right hand and you give it with your right hand. You use your left hand, you get in big trouble. Well, it's a similar thing. It's the ultimate disrespect, maybe even on bigger levels, that Ham saw the nakedness of his father, and instead of covering the nakedness, he mocked it. So now we contrast that behavior with Shem and Japheth. Shem and Japheth, instead of going in and joining Ham by mocking his father, they come in, they get the blanket on their shoulder, and so as not to defile or disgrace him, they move backwards to cover him. What can we get from all of this? Two takeaways. What are areas in our lives that we are tempted to find pleasure and take joy at the detriment of the expense of others? And as I was sharing this, we are in this unique season, not unique, I should say that, but we're in a very conflicted time. Everybody's trying to define and understand the nature of justice. And in many ways, this relates to that same topic. What does justice look like? And when justice happens, how indeed should we respond? Because one of the unique properties of this story is that it's not like Noah was doing good things and then he was disgraced. The brother had overindulged and was suffering the consequences of that overindulgence. But yet still there is a punishment for Ham for finding pleasure at the detriment of his father. As I went on this journey these past 2 weeks about what is the relationship between finding pleasure in justice. When you see a criminal that has killed so many different people, and then finally they get into the courtroom and then justice is established and they are put behind bars, how are we meant to respond? Is it just meant to be joy and happiness? And because you see a lot of that, right? And depending on how you understand justice, if it's the other way and they're pleaded not guilty and they get to go home and then you're just happy and you're joyful, neglecting the fact that there may have been other people who died from that same person's hands. And while I'm not here to give a specific answer, I do think there's a tension we're meant to live in as Christians, even when justice is established. These past 2 years, we've had so many different dramatic, controversial incidents where we have all had our different expectations and understandings of what justice should look like. And when they happened the way we wanted to, and if it didn't, we were either indignant with crazy rage and anger, or we were over-celebrated like someone had celebrated their birthday. And I think it's easy for us to have just happiness and joy when justice is established, when we forget what justice being established should look like in our own lives. What I'm trying to say is this. It is a lot easier to only find pleasure and happiness when justice is established, when you forget what justice could have looked like in your own life, if not for the grace of God. There's a weight to it. At least there should be. When we see justice established in the lives of another person. Because as believers who have the Spirit of God within us, even when someone is down and out and at their lowest of luck, it becomes upon us to show the same grace that God has indeed showed us. Now, when wrong is being dealt with, does that mean we do not celebrate? Absolutely not. But it does mean that as you are caught by the celebration, you are also reminded of the other side of that situation, that someone has lost hope. Someone might not have another chance again. And so the Christian heart or the Christian persona is one that is always weighing both sides of the situation, and both sides of them are indeed affecting them. We should be a people that when the worst is happening to others around us, even if we think they deserve it, we should be the primary people leading the way, leading the group, and finding ways to figuratively cover their nakedness, like Shem and Japheth. But how can we do that? What are ways that we can act that out and implement that in our different lives? Well, one of the announcements we had was December 14th at Jimmy Hill. There are people in that room whose society have seen their nakedness, if you will, and responded instead of responding like Shem and Japheth, have instead responded like Ham and chosen to mock and chosen to disgrace. And so the call then comes upon us as believers to, instead of finding light and finding humor and fun in another person's lowest moment, whether they did it themselves or whether it was done to them, we can be a people who choose to cover their nakedness. Or maybe it's ministries that are connected to our church like Aspirement, where there are the vulnerables of the society, those who are in such a place in which society happens to them and they do very little to it yet as kids, as vulnerables. And while many might cast them off and put them off to the side and say, you will reap what you sow, or you will be a fruit of your environment, we can be, as the church, lights and images of the gospel, that same gospel that looks at our own sin, that looks at our own nakedness, if you could put it, and covered it. We too can do that for others. There are a myriad of ways that we can serve as the light of Christ in our community. How indeed are we doing it? That brings us to the second part, the curse. Verse 25. This is Noah's response when he realized what Ham had done to him. He said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Now, when we get to the curse, it's even more important to be reminded of who the original audience was. We have to remember the purpose for why the second half was here. Many of you who have been in the church and heard many stories know how this particular part has been twisted over the many, many, many years. Whether it was to support the idea of slavery, or that black people, or those brown-skinned who were arguably descendants from Ham, were forever cursed because of this particular curse right here. It's completely false. And I would dive into certain aspects of why it's false. But for now, I want us to start with the main reason why this was written. We've seen two things that I've pointed out already. The first was that Ham, but then Noah takes his curse and starts to specifically recite it on who? On Canaan, okay? The second thing is that Canaan is not the only child of Ham. There are many other children of Ham, but specifically, Noah decides to bring curses upon Canaan. Why is that so? Well, Leviticus chapter 18 is a chapter in the book of Leviticus, obviously, where the laws are being given to the Israelite people. When they're being given to the Israelite people, you see repeatedly, specifically in that chapter, that they are always being reminded that you should not live your lives like the Canaanites. That specific chapter is talking about sexual immorality and incestuous relationships, the abominations that were happening within that land. And the instruction from the Lord was, do not live as the Canaanites were. So when they were hearing Moses explain the beginnings and how they came to where they were also going to hear in that specific section why the Canaanites are as bad as they actually are. Like, why are these guys so horrible? Why is that the specific land that God has indeed called us to overtake? It wasn't just that God saw them and was like, oh, I like that land, let me wipe them out so I can put my guys there. No, it was also because the Canaanite people were a fantastically corrupt group of people. They had so rejected the instructions and the livelihoods of the Lord. They didn't care about morality. They were doing as they wanted. They chased after their flesh. They did all that they wanted to do. And so in many ways, this is, think around the fire, old folks telling us about how we came to be. This is the, okay, makes sense. So Canaan, their forefather was like that too. Okay. And Ham was like that too. Oh, okay, it makes sense. Y'all ever had that one family member or that new person you meet, or maybe someone you dated at one point, and there's this really weird quirk they have to them, and you're like, what? How do they keep on doing it? And they invite you to one family gathering, and you just see why. Auntie, uncle, everybody, they all have that same quirk. It's like on a serious level, though. It's like similar here. It's this understanding of this, if you will, is an explanation of the Canaanite people and why they are the way they are. But that explanation forces other questions. So are you telling me, Daniel, that because they're Canaanites now, that they are all damned to behave and respond a certain way? That all Canaanites were damned to live and act and disgrace people and to work so sinfully towards others like Ham did and like Canaan did? Well, the Bible gives us many, many examples of people who were from or descendants of Canaan, but responded favorably. And there's one very famous one. She's a lady. In fact, she had one of the most immoral jobs and vocations. Anybody guess what I'm talking about? Rahab. She was a Canaanite. And so it forces this question, okay, Daniel, so what is this? And no, it's not saying that all people that come from Canaan are damned in that way. What is this passage saying then if it's not really saying that? What this passage is saying is continuing a similar conversation we had a few weeks ago when I preached last. And it's the relationship between family and also the relationship with sin. And how the truth is that because we grew up under broken people and broken parents, if you will, whoever your guardian was, we learn sinful habits that apart from the grace of God, we are left prone to repeating those same things. Apart from the grace of God, there is a proclivity to live out a certain way. A wonderful example was the relationship between Cain and Abel. Who remembers what God told Cain after the sacrifice? He warned him. He said, look, why is your face so cast down? I'm paraphrasing, Daniel Sheshki translation. Paraphrase. Why is your face so cast down? Be careful, because if you don't control it, sin is lying at the door, ready to devour you. And so in many senses, this curse right here serves as a warning. It recognizes the fact, I'm sure at that very moment, after Noah had been disgraced by Ham, saw that little Canaan boy over there causing terror on the other side of the plantation, like, hey, bro, you are just like your daddy. And as a fruit and as a confirmation of that, that curse was proclaimed over them. But it does not mean the grace of God cannot come in and deliver people from that same group of people. And Rahab is a perfect example. So, is the curse of Ham real? No, absolutely not. But what the curse does do is that it reminds us of the fact that there are repercussions of our sin, and when we live out as examples of sin to others, it impacts those who are looking up to us and following our example. So hence we must be careful. As I reached the end of this whole thing, I was reading and I was like, man, I would really like, and you guys know what my topic is. My topic is the mess of sin and the hope of Christ. But like if there's one thing we've understood this morning, it's the mess of sin. The question is, where is the hope of Christ in this particular passage? And it ends on a pretty dark note. I mean, first of all, it ends with the curse. And if you want to be really technical, verse 29, it talks about how Noah lived 950 years. And the last word of that whole passage is what? He died. So where is the hope of Christ? As I've heard a lot with many of you guys, and even today with Jason's opening, it's been an interesting past few weeks for me. And in the interesting, I've found myself having to fight for a certain level of hope. And my personality tends to err on the side of I like to make stuff happen. So the people who like to make stuff happen, when things don't happen the way you want them to happen, what happens? You go crazy. And it's really hard to find hope in the midst of that, right? What I've come to see is that the irony of it is that in the midst of your helplessness, that's where the hope of Christ screams the loudest. If you think about it properly. Because if you could do absolutely everything, then why would you and when would you ever find time to look up to him? And I think it's in the same vein as I was studying this passage and I was reminding myself over all the chapters that we have come and read and looked through. And I get to this part and I'm looking for the hope in this passage. I mean, this is basically the end of the Noah story. Next is just the descendants and then we move to the Tower of Babel. So this is the conclusion and it ends with a curse. And it's the very fact that it's so hard to find an explicit hope that the hope is all the more loud. I'm like, what do you mean? Let me explain it to you. God tried again. He cleansed the whole earth with the flood. The flood didn't work. The only guy, maybe you can call him another Adam. There's a perfect Adam. This is another Adam, right? Comes, he's left, he's delivered from the floods, and he's still here. Sin is still here. It becomes abundantly clear that there's no amount of water on this earth that can cleanse this earth and humanity of its sinful capabilities. It failed, but it also shows there's a need for something else. We learned and we heard about the obedience of Noah, but apparently because he too is the son of a human father and a human mother, there's only so much he could do. He can't actually save humanity either because we still have him overindulging and we still see the examples that his sons indeed continued to follow. And the nakedness factor, we would have hoped that after the flood, there would be no nakedness problems. But apparently there is still indeed a nakedness problem. And the serpent, yes, that nasty little thing from Genesis chapter 3 seems to still be having this kind of control and harassing humanity here and there. But all of this, all of these problems and the inability for a flood or even Noah's obedience to help us only points to our need for Jesus to save us. And he did. That's the reminder, right? That's the reminder in the lack of what seems to be a loud shouting hope in this passage is that in and of ourselves, in and of humanity, and in and of every other thing, we are absolutely limited and unable to deal with the sin problem that so deeply resides in humanity and our broken world. And that the only answer is the man who represented the flood a little bit when he was baptized by John the Baptist, the man who was born by a human woman, but by an eternal Father, the man who alone looked at our eternal and spiritual nakedness. And instead of looking at us at our fallen, weakest, and most broken point, did not mock us like Ham, but instead, like Shem and Japheth, if you will allow me to play with this scene, spiritually covered our nakedness. The man who alone, by his death and resurrection, has not only empowered us to trust him more, but also given us the capability to extend that same grace that has been shown to us to be shown to others. So may we be a people who are diligent, who are faithful, in covering the nakedness of each other and others. And not only glorying when we feel like justice has been met, but also, just in addition, be willing to love even the worst of sinners. May we forever, daily, fight the repercussions of sin, knowing very well that our Savior saved us through his sacrifice, through his resurrection, so that we can live in obedience, but also be light bearers of the same grace in our communities and lives. You bow your heads and pray.